Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 263 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on September 10th, 2023. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's show, we're going to cover some news as ever since the last show, but our main topic will be our second of three Legacy of Yangchen review discussion podcasts. So, in this one, we are going to be covering the middle third of the book. So, this will be chapter 14, Bad Company, up to and including chapter 26, Aftershocks. So it'll leave us with one more podcast discussion to do on this book to cover the final chapters, but we will get into that Yangchen discussion later on. So we'll jump into the news first of all. So the first one here is something that happened relatively soon after the last podcast, and it's a bit of an interesting one because I think this is a piece of information that kind of went a bit under the radar. It just sort of happened. People were like, oh, there really hasn't been a follow-up to this one just yet. But it is that there is a new Avatar The Last Airbender mobile game coming in 2024. So this is different, separate from Avatar Generations. This one is going to be developed by Tilting Point and real-time strategy game developer AN Games. It is going to be an official Avatar game. It's covering Avatar and Korra. And there's some interesting stuff about this. We'll get into the details of this in just a second, but it is very interesting simply that there is another Avatar mobile game coming out. So what are your initial thoughts on seeing this happen? We're getting another mobile game.
I don't know. I mean, I try not to, poo on the sort of mobile game, I guess, craze that, everything's coming these days. So I don't know. I think we sort of knew that this was sort of happening and coming in. This is sort of like, it's a good IP for doing this sort of stuff with, because there's like so many, it's a huge world. There's different ways you can take it. There's so many characters and there's a lot of different facets that you can expand upon. So, it is cool to see that they are getting, another game in general. And it sounds like it could be interesting. It definitely feels like this game is more on par with more of what like the current zeitgeist of mobile games are at the moment, when we go into breaking it down. But I don't know, I guess it's just another one out there that they're trying to develop this sort of push the idea of the show going and coming and stuff like that, which is cool to see. It's just it sort of feels like it's like they're pushing all this even before the real show really comes back in full force, which it's good to see that they're committed to it, right? Like it shows that they're willing to put money, even if it is on these side projects that, in the grand scheme of things, don't take as much of a huge budget as some of the other, projects that people might more so want. But it's good to see that they're doing it in some capacity. I just, sometimes wish it went a different way in terms of what they're producing.
Yeah, that's typically been the discussion about these things. It's like, game gets announced, but wait, it's a mobile game. Why isn't it the AAA game we've always wanted? And it's just different levels like that will probably have to wait until Avatar Studios has properly established itself and we get a bigger Avatar game. But for now, Avatar Generations has been a success. This seems interesting enough. I'd be pretty critical of the kind of early announcement here, just because there's a art asset associated with this, and it's the most nothing imagery out there because it's just like main Korra characters, main Avatar characters, but it's art we've seen before for years. And with the Korra stuff, it's like the earliest promo images for the characters imaginable. The background of the image, I can't obviously place, like, in terms of knowing exactly where that image comes from, but I think it's just Republic City, and I don't think it's super representative of whatever this plot is that they're talking about. So that's the sort of stuff that just feels a little bit weird, where you can sort of tell that, like, okay, they specifically sent the press release to me because I guess I covered Generations in a way where, like, oh, someone's actually interested in talking about it. But you often do get the idea that, like, you are treated as if you know nothing about the franchise with some of these press releases, and it's not like super up to speed. So for me, the image is just a bit like, It was here. But there is some interesting stuff in the press release. They do give an idea about what the plot of this game is going to be. It says interact with beloved characters and work together with other players to defeat a barbarian death cult that worships an evil spirit set on dominating the world. Now they mention Avatar and Korra. The image, like I said, has Team Aang characters and Team Korra characters. It is unclear how that exactly works together necessarily, in terms of, is that just a gameplay kind of thing where you can cross generations, but it's actually set in one era or the other. It says, launching in 2024, a game's official title and additional details will be announced in the coming months, and it's been a month since this initial one, so hopefully, at some point, maybe this month or next month, we'll hear something more about this. They do give a breakdown of what type of game it's going to be. It says it's going to be a multiplayer strategy mobile game. Players will take on the role of a leader tasked with building an army and community to restore balance in the Avatar world. Strategy is key, as players will need to build cities, manage resources, construct and upgrade buildings, explore the world, and engage in tactical combat to become victorious. Focus on city building, cooperative gameplay and exploration, expand territories, manage resources, and restore harmony to the Avatar world. And that's really all there is. Definitely, to me, the most interesting thing is the whole barbarian death cult, because we have some mention of barbarians. There's some cult-like stuff in Avatar, but this combination of words together seems sort of interesting, especially depending on what era it's set. I assume it will be a canon story, but we'll see exactly how they do that. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of the details that are actually here about this?
Yeah, it does sound interesting. I mean, the idea of, getting another story, if it is canon, and how that relates to things is always a welcome thing to see. And it does feel like it's, I guess, a bit different than what we've seen so far. So, I like that they're hopefully going along that sort of path. And, there are spirits involved with it, which, makes sense in this sort of context that they're going for here. And, as far as the sort of little bit we can glean from the game mechanics, it seems like that's the whole idea of this multiplayer strategy, and you're working with others in sort of a larger capacity. That seems pretty on point for a lot of the games that I've seen these days. So it feels like it'll probably do pretty well. We'll see how well overall it does, if it can sort of keep things going with updates and any other sort of DLC type things that they do for it. So definitely sounds like it could be, a lot of people's cup of tea in terms of the type of game that people, want to play. So I'm curious to see how it checks out and everything, and when it actually has an official date in 2024, since that, could be all the way at the end of the year, really.
Yeah, that's the big thing here, is just there's kind of almost nothing to say about it until they actually show us what it is. It's kind of the exact same with Avatar Generations, where you can tell us the genre of game all you want and give a text description of this and that, but we need visuals in terms of what is the gameplay. It's the same with Avatar Quest for Balance. You need to actually talk about the game and not just rely on the basics to kind of get it across. So yeah, we'll give updates on this whenever they come out. Next piece of information is kind of interesting. It is kind of, for the most part, our only Avatar Studios information, but it's not the sort of fan-focused, in a way, information. It is Avatar Academy. They initially announced that this would be sort of coming soon. Now we have the details, application open. This is a trainee program to basically get new people into working on Avatar Studios projects. So it is a paid position for 6 months in Nickelodeon Animation Studio in Burbank. You have to apply for it. The description of the job seems basically like some of the jobs we've talked about previously that have went up. Just obviously more of a kind of a initial kind of entry style position. But the idea of this seems to be that you will get training effectively from the main Avatar Studios staff here. So it's an interesting one. They seem to be recruiting for what we of course seem to know is a lot of different productions that are going into production for Avatar Studios, and that like there's the movie, but then there's like two other movies, and we're expecting a series, potentially multiple series. They haven't announced a lot of that stuff, but you have to assume that all of this is happening not just for that one movie, but for all the other stuff that's happening in the background as well. So it shows us, I think, a little bit of progress, and it's definitely like an interesting thing to have an animation training program, but like specifically for Avatar. I think that's probably the most like confidence inspiring kind of part of this, that it's not just the Nickelodeon Academy, it's Avatar Academy, and it's all about working on Avatar stuff. But what are your thoughts on Avatar Academy?
I mean, I like the idea. I mean, it's not like uncommon for studios and different projects to have these sort of, essentially like co-op, paid internship type positions, which I think is really cool that they're, essentially it's a full-time position that you're doing for a set period of time and, training and stuff. And, people are fans of Avatar, so why not use that name and that pull to get people who are really interested in the projects and working on, their sort of animations and stuff like that. And, I'm sure, depending on how well the person does, it could lead into something longer and more, prolific for them in their careers and stuff like that. So, it sounds like it's a cool thing, and it seems like, people are interested in, with Avatar Studios coming back in a big way, as far as we can tell with the shows and projects that they have, lined up for the foreseeable future. This seems like this goes hand in hand in their sort of, like you're saying, commitment to, what they're doing in the future and stuff. So if they're trying to, develop their own talent from within, who are really going to be interested in working on their projects, then, it seems like it's a good program that they're starting up.
Yeah, like it shows planning for the future, I guess, that they want to get these kind of new people in and, keep them there for multiple projects on Avatar. So we'll see how it goes. Again, like I said, they need to probably announce some of this other stuff. Like if all the rumors come true, we're also expecting the first series, like show, to come out in 2025 as well. And that actually hasn't been like announced officially yet. So when is that going to actually get revealed? Does the timing on this tell us anything about like other news? Probably not, but New York Comic Con is coming up next month. There's a chance, probably a low chance at this point, of news, but there's something, because we're getting towards, of course, 2024, a year before the first movie in October 2025. They have to start talking like eventually, is the thing. But we'll move on. So the next one here is what seems to be it's a kind of combination thing here, in that like the actual news is kind of almost lesser than the news of who actually posted this news, and that is Avatar News's last piece of news seems to be confirming that the Avatar live action Netflix show is coming in February 2024. So that date seems in line with, I suppose, where kind of we seem to view where production is, where it seems like it's been a little bit delayed. They want to spend extra time on the visual effects and stuff like that, and they're waiting, pushing it off into 2024, when I think it was more tentatively scheduled for like summer or late this year. Makes sense. Still wish we knew more about it, but February, March definitely seems in line with probably where it should be. But any thoughts on this date for the live action?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully this is the actual date, and sooner rather than later we can see some other stuff to sort of, I guess, get more hype around it, if that's actually when it's coming out.
Mm-hmm. And there is a little bit more hype around Avatar for Netflix, just because the One Piece live action actually released, and it's been received like exceptionally well. So both of these were kind of going like side by side, effectively in production, as similar shows getting a kind of animation to live action adaptation. And probably One Piece was the one I think people had more doubts about, but it actually nailed it. And it's not just considered like good, it's considered like very good from most of the reviews. And that's definitely kind of my thoughts on it for the most part. So it's obviously hard to compare two separate productions, but if the approach taken is in any way similar, then it gives you a little bit more confidence for Avatar. But what about you on that front? Have you checked out live action One Piece, or what are your thoughts on that in relation to Avatar live action?
No, I haven't seen it yet, but I have heard many of the same things that you've just said there, that it's been pretty good. Most people have received it really well, which, yeah, I mean, it is a different project, like you said, but I think one to one, if you're trying to compare sort of the production techniques that they're using and some of the, technologies that they've, expressed that they're using to try to make, the productions as good as they can, that, they would have some sort of, shared knowledge on those projects, even if, the production crews and all that stuff are actually separate or stuff like that. There's, some believe it over, even if it's just producers and stuff like that, or higher ups in Netflix that are keeping these things in mind. So I don't know. I think it's, cool that that was doing so well. It does give some help. I don't know. It feels like it would be cool if sort of the production for the Avatar one did more of the sort of outreach stuff that the One Piece one did, which, I think they, especially their actors, when they could do that sort of stuff, were very sort of open about that sort of stuff. So it would have been cool to see that for Avatar as well. It seems like Avatar is a lot more guarded in their sort of outreach of stuff in comparison.
Yeah, I think the only main difference is that, like, I think Oda, who's the manga writer and artist for One Piece, was actually like heavily involved in some sort of an oversight position on live action One Piece. Whereas, of course, we know Mike and Brian are not actually attached anymore because of reasons to this production. Now, again, we don't know how specifically that all kind of works out in terms of, was it just that Avatar Studios came up and that's mostly why it happened, but then their posts when they left live action suggested otherwise, and there's some weirdness there, but like that was actually quite a while ago at this point. That might not be the case anymore. Lots probably changed on that production since then. But the related piece of news is that obviously that one came from Avatar News. Avatar News then basically announced that they are done. It is goodbye to Avatar News. He chose to announce it on basically exactly the 10-year anniversary of when he started Avatar News, I think previously known as Korra News. And so, yeah, after 10 years of covering Korra and Avatar News, he is stepping away from this. There doesn't seem to be any obvious thing about, someone else, running the account or anything like that. He's just saying, a new chapter begins. He's leaving this behind. That's it. It's definitely a little sudden because he seemed like especially interested in live action Avatar. So the fact that he's kind of stepping away from this, like kind of in a way just before the big news, the actual release type stuff is going to happen, is a bit interesting. But yeah, we don't know the reasons. He said it's not because of any sort of cease and desist type thing, but we don't really know for sure. There's a bunch of things that could have happened, like especially in recent times. I think he has been more known for being the kind of insider source of information, and if he maybe doesn't have any of those sources anymore, there was, at least with the leaked image from the movie, the Avatar Studios movie, I think he was contacted about that. I don't think anything serious happened, but that might be a factor in things as well. But either way, it does mean, like, in terms of news going forward, we have lost pretty much our best source of insider information, because a lot of the others are just general kind of entertainment insiders. And so if you follow them, it's like one tweet in 100 might be about Avatar, that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how news actually goes. Obviously things will be better once they officially start talking about this, but certainly for the last couple of years, I think he's played a pretty important role in terms of just giving us a little bit of an insight into what's actually going on behind the scenes. But interesting nonetheless. But do you have any thoughts on Avatar news wrapping things up after 10 years?
Yeah, no, it is too bad. I think it definitely, served for a hub for a lot of people, and since a lot of that information isn't readily available, it was sort of a good place to go, and an easy place to, I guess, sort of navigate, especially for the site and stuff like that. So it is too bad. I wonder if they're gonna sort of change gears somehow and be in some other place for news.
So yeah, it does mean that there's we're getting very low on like news accounts, sources of information that are kind of known in the community. I actually got a surprise like spike in Twitter followers following this announcement, so I think I was recommended to by a few people here. But of course, I don't really get like insider information, but you know, I actually cover all the news. We cover all the news here. But yeah, that is a little bit of an interesting one there. And then our final piece of news is some merchandise news, and that is that we'd had rumors about the next wave of Avatar Funko Pops, and now we have pictures. So this started off with the official reveal here of the exclusive Entertainment Earth exclusive Kyoshi glow in the dark, you know, it's Spirit Kyoshi pop. So Kyoshi finally gets a pop. Very, very interesting. She gets one before Roku, but interestingly not before Kurok, even though that's a weird situation with the whole NFT thing. But still, Kyoshi before Roku. It's an interesting pop, definitely, because they've gone for the full Spirit version. Whereas I think people would really like the full color version as well. We'll see what they do with that. But yeah, this is a Entertainment Earth exclusive for like America, and then it will be Funko Europe for Europe and related regions. Not sure about certain other regions, but it for the most part has been made clear where this is actually going to be available from. So before we get into the others, what are your thoughts on this, which probably ends up being the most significant of these new reveals, the Kyoshi Funko Pop?
Yeah, I mean, it looks cool. I mean, I think, most of the pops look pretty interesting. I don't think they've done too bad a job with any of them. But yeah, I do wish it was the color one. I think that would have been cool to see in this sort of format. I mean, I guess it's because they have this sort of deals and stuff like that, so it has to be sort of exclusive and different and stuff like that. But I don't know. I guess that's just sort of how pops work in general in that sort of market, which is, I don't know. It's an interesting one being from the outsider who's not sort of like that in the pops, just seeing how they're produced and sort of released. But it does look cool. I'm sure it looks pretty cool when it's glowed. They have like a bit of an image there, but I don't think that does it really justice. But yeah, it's cool to see that they're still going with them.
hmm Yeah, so there's been a previous like Spirit Funko Pop. There was an exclusive Aang. I actually have it. Um,
Yeah.
the glow works well, but obviously mainly works if you use black light. Like you basically have to use black light to make it look like the pictures sort of look like with the glow. If you just try to use like normal light, you have to like literally keep it like almost directly on the light for like a huge amount of time to sort of quote unquote charge it enough to where you actually notice it. But with black light it actually does look pretty nice. But that's just the way all those things tend to work. But then on the back of the Kyoshi box was where we actually got the reveal, because they haven't been officially revealed. This seems to be the next wave of commons, which should be available everywhere, the non-exclusive pops. So we have Floating Aang, Azula, Iroh, Momo, and then Appa with armor, which is a pop super, meaning it's like a 6-inch pop. So Floating Aang is Book 1 Aang holding an airball before he falls out of the sky. I think this is referencing 104, where he does this to get away from the fangirls, but then falls into them. Bit of an interesting pop. The Azula, this is the third Azula, but the first common Azula is from towards the end of the Agni Kai with Zuko, where she starts to use lightning just before she fires it at Katara. So you can see here she's charging up the lightning attack. Her hair is completely all over the place. There's also Iroh, also doing lightning. So this is different than the previous Iroh, which was just him holding the T, a very kind of peaceful Iroh. This is Iroh in action doing some lightning, and he even has a bit of a kind of effect base as well for that as well. And then the Momo and Appa are both 309, basically Nightmares and Daydreams. Daydream, Ronin Momo, and Samurai Appa here. So there's been a bit of an obsession with some of the recent merchandise with these two iterations of these characters. They're in Avatar Generations. They're getting a like exclusive Dark Horse statue. They get U2s. Now they get Funko Pops. Not sure why the obsession with these two when I think there's better versions of Appa and Momo to do, but I think that the general reception here has been they look nice, but it's probably not the lineup most people would have gone for with the next wave of commons, and not enough like really unique stuff or character choice. But what are your thoughts on the five commons, I guess, for the next wave?
Yeah, I mean, I think they look cool. The designs work well. I think probably out of these, probably Iroh is probably my personal favorite out of these. I mean, the Momo and Appa, I think I don't know. I guess it's just their acts in that sort of episode was so sort of iconic and sort of out of the norm that you see for those characters, especially since they were like voiced and everything like that. That sort of like stands out in a lot of people who look back on those episodes and nostalgia and stuff like that. So I definitely can see sort of the general appeal of them. I don't know if it's warranted for as much attention as they get it. Maybe just because it's sort of like a crossover thing, and that sort of just naturally gets more attention on its own. But yeah, it's cool to see them. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I guess we're just gonna always have to have Aang in some form or fashion, even if it's not something that sort of stands out as much in terms of popularity. Because I mean, I recall that episode and everything in it, but I don't think that would have been one of my thoughts for like another version of a Aang to have. But I don't know. It's cool that they're still going with it.
Yeah, like there is so many different angles you can do, and I think there's even rumors about like other ones that may or may not have actually kind of come true or not. But I think the stuff that people mainly want to see, even if you're going for repeat characters, is like where's book 3 Katara, where's book 3 Sokka. There is on the more recent list of rumors a Warrior Sokka exclusive, which we haven't seen yet, so that could be book 3 Sokka. But there's stuff like that. Where is our Roku, with or without Fang, whatever way you want to do it? Is Kyoshi going to get a normal pop to go with the Spirit one? And then there's lots of other stuff, like, Suki, we have the initial Suki, but, Suki in her kind of like Fire Nation outfit at the end, the main team in their Fire Nation outfits at the end is options. Many have pointed out you could do an Appa with armor, but just have it be normal Appa from the Day of Black Sun in his armor. That would have been a nice one to do, but it is what it is. There's probably still a couple of exclusive we still have to see, but yeah, that has been the news. The most next upcoming thing is Avatar Quest for Balance, which is on the 22nd of September. There were extra clips, but they were very basic. The main thing we seem to learn from them is just that the game does appear to be more of a puzzle game than like an action game, which is kind of interesting. It still has some combat in it, but puzzle seems to be the main genre of what the game actually is. So we're not too far away from that. I'll be getting it and doing some sort of coverage on it. But the main thing with that is just that no one seems hyper excited about that game is the kind of main thing. But yeah, I suppose just quickly on that before we get into Yangchen, what are your kind of, like, I suppose, final thoughts before the release of Quest for Balance?
Yeah, I don't know. It feels like this is, I don't want to say like it's not important, but it doesn't feel like it has as much pull to it as it could potentially have, or that it should have. I don't know. I feel like from all the stuff that we hear, it feels like people want to hype up the sort of mobile games more than this sort of I guess mid-tier sort of console desktop type of game here that we're getting. So I don't know, it's an odd one, maybe because it is more puzzle based, it's not having as much sort of draw to it, but I don't know, it's an odd one.
But yeah, that's been the news, and we'll move into our main topic for this episode, which is going to be our review for the middle part of the most recent novel, The Legacy of Yangchen. And like I said before, we'll be covering chapter 14 to chapter 26. So we're going to start with the chapter that's called Bad Company. We covered the first 13 chapters in the last podcast, and we'll cover the next, I think it's 11 or so chapters in the next podcast. So, where we left off, we had just seen like basically kind of like the inciting incident of the book. We had the big kind of escape sequence, the assassination. So Kalyan has killed Honsha and got Thappa out. There's been some interesting reveals about how like Thappa seems to be the only surviving combustion bender left. Him having killed the other two. Yangchen has been exiled from the Northern Air Temple, and that's pretty much where we've kind of left things, in a pretty bad spot here. But we'll jump in here with chapter 14, which is called Bad Company. So we do get, this is our second and last, unfortunately, Chai-Si focused chapter. It's pretty short. It's basically just we find out that Thapa makes his way to Chai-Si at this kind of facility that she has gained control over. And they're just kind of like eating together. And we just get the idea that Thapa is, of course, this really kind of messy eater. Chai-Si doesn't like this, but of course he is the only combustion bender left. She's not outwardly, I suppose, like criticizing him for the decisions that he has made, but when he does start to kind of do what he was doing with Honsha and start to ask for like crazy extra amounts of money, she does refuse. And when it seems like he's about to walk out or sort of like force her hand with violence, she activates brainwashing on him. And this is the kind of reveal in the book that some part of the unanimity training program does involve brainwashing the subjects. And so we get a kind of Earth King has invited you to Lake Laogai-esque moment here. But of course, the wording is different here. She says, upon fickle whim, the mind invites its masters. And Thapa responds, the eyes and ears, four gates to block the conquering truth. So it's kind of Guru Shoken kind of quotes being used here instead. And she basically just ends the chapter kind of asking him to kind of bow down, and then at the end, like, oh, speak more naturally, but then stab yourself. And then he's like, how many times? And so it is the reveal that she has this brainwashing, extra control over him, in addition to just being a powerful person herself. So interesting. We don't get too many like reveals here that the brainwashing is the reveal of the chapter. So what are your thoughts on what happens in this chapter?
I mean, I guess it shouldn't be, too surprising because we've seen that in the Avatar world before, but it was something to see, how it was used here, how, it was such, a quick thing, how, this was really her, Chai-Si's sort of ace in the hole that she had this sort of in the back pocket to actually have, the full loyalty of unanimity in this sort of situation here, and how of course the people the three combustion benders here, of course not fully aware of it themselves, and sort of this was part of their training, which just makes you think when you later on when we get to parts where we hear a little bit more in detail about the training, like how how involved and how strenuous it was to actually go through this training and to actually be able to sort of like survive it on their own, and just her, I don't know, her foresight, her planning, her, I guess, thoughtfulness, for all the wrong reasons, of course, towards her actual goals here. So yeah, it was something to see here. It definitely harkens back to what we've seen before in the Earth Kingdom and how everything was being done down there, and sort of the activation phrase here and how it's just sort of immediately just sort of flips a switch, and how she mentions that he took the best towards this particular conditioning. So it would have been interesting to see how this would have worked on sort of the other two, and the one that we know is there, or even the one that we meet later on in this sort of section that we're going over, if the sort of that part of the training, how early this started in their training for a combustion bender, or is this something that was sort of like done at the end after they had proved that they were, worth being sort of more invested in. But yeah, it's definitely, I don't know, I guess could say it's a surprising bit to sort of see here.
Yeah, like we'll discuss this more later when we get to the other brainwashing scenes, but it is interesting that like it's almost like something that's not really needed in the book, because the brainwashing never really comes out effectively. Like our characters never seem to be aware that this has actually happened, and it's not like it's a setup for something in the future necessarily, but it just means like it kind of ends up feeling like the book didn't need brainwashing, because you could have just written Thapa to just actually be willing to kind of follow Chai-Si because of who Chai-Si is, You didn't need to write him as being so kind of willful that he requires brainwashing to control. And I think it's just more towards the end of the book and like how the book approaches doing reveals or kind of not doing reveals that it kind of feels like they just throw a lot of concepts at you without actually like touching on them. And that like we're here to discover stuff about combustion bending primarily, but now they've also added in brainwashing, which we don't know the origins of. They didn't explain it in Avatar. They don't explain it here. You know, the question is going to come up. How did she know about this? How did Chai-Si know to do this in the first place? And that's ultimately what doesn't get answered, but we'll get to those moments. But next we go into chapter 15, which is called The Oathbreaker. So we get the arrival in Taku, so we finally get to see the last of the Shang cities that we hadn't seen before. And the description we get here is just basically this is an incredibly well-off place known for excess and wealth. The team is here kind of undercover, dressed as airbenders. And there's a few interesting details here, like they make a significant note of the Great Gong of Taku, which will become important in the kind of finale of the book. There's a reveal that Kavik realizes, oh, Yangchen has not told and doesn't plan to tell the other members about her exile. So that becomes a bit of a kind of secret piece of information that Kavik has in relation to Yangchen, the others don't. But the rest of the chapter is basically just around like Kavik's dynamic with the rest of the group and how they all get on really well, but he feels a little bit like an outsider because of the betrayal, and how does he actually handle or even approach trying to make amends, given that he's basically forced into a position where he has to betray them. And Jujinta even kind of confronts him about this. Like, I know you've been like sneaking out to meet with someone, but the only reason I'm not kind of like attacking you here and now is because Yangchen like really clearly told me to drop the issue. And it's just, it ends on the note of like Kavik realizing that this is going to be lonely. He didn't realize how lonely being put in this position of like already having betrayed these people, but now expecting to betray them again at some point in the future. So some interesting stuff here. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, I thought this was a good one to get sort of, more introspective, I guess you could say, on Kavik and his thoughts and, how he's feeling personally about, again, everything that he's done and I guess everything that he's going to have to continue doing and sort of, remembering sort of, I guess you could say, sort of the better times, better-ish times that they had together and, how everything, he's had sort of this, I guess, pretty, well or, balanced sort of relationship with Jujinta, but, obviously it's been strained and, Jujinta, just his personality is very sort of rough and gruff, so to sort of, lose that, altogether and how, he's just sort of at odds at end. And this is, it's not like this is solved here or anything like this. Like this continues even later on to what we're going to talk about, but how that's just sort of, I guess really sort of grading on Kavik and his sort of, sense of right and wrong. I think a lot of these times it comes across, pretty well, which I think the book is just trying to hammer at home so that, eventually you can be, okay with Kavik and his choices and stuff like that. That, he does have, some morals. He does have sort of a good core to himself, even though he's been put in such a hard position of, double crossing and then, trying to recross and everything like that. So it, it does a good job of breaking that down, that sort of thoughts that he's having.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 16 is Matters of Pride. This is a interesting kind of quick chapter because we jump into the middle of the next sequence of chapters, which we will then go back around to explain how this even came about. This is something that FCE does a couple of times in this book, and as I went through it in my videos on my channel, I think there's definitely an agreement from most people in the comments that it was probably something that was done a few too many times. Like, I get we have some reveals to do here, but like some of this stuff should have just been done in order. And I think this is probably an example of a time when this chapter probably wasn't needed, because this is like a 3-page chapter, basically 4 pages, and it's followed up by probably one of the longest chapters in the book because a lot needs to get explained. And I think you could have just rolled them in together, because all we really get in this chapter is like, okay, Yangchen and an undercover Kavik are playing a gambling game with the Zongdu of Taku, whose name is Awashi, and they're losing really, really badly. There's a talk of like a plan having gone wrong here. They weren't expecting it to be so tough. The main thing you get in this chapter is basically just Iwashi. The characterization of Iwashi is basically the idea that he is all about money, and he views money as being this kind of matter of life and death. Not in the sense that like he'll put himself on the line for money, but that by taking money from people, he very much views it as like, how much food could this money buy? And if I take this amount of money from someone, how much would this affect them in terms of their ability to eat? It's a very interesting concept, and we get the idea of like the amount of money Yangchen and Kavik are losing here. Iwashi is killing them, and he means it like literally, because think about how much this money means. And then we I don't know if we get it here, I think it might be in the next chapter, we find out they're actually betting with the budget of Bin So it is actually, taking food like away from other people, and this is why Yangchen is so uncomfortable with what's kind of having to happen here. But the chapter just ends with the idea of like, the plan has gone off awry, but they need to continue. They have to keep going and hope that it turns around. But what are your thoughts on this chapter here, where we jump in the middle of a game of Sparrowbone?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the first time I read it, it definitely was a bit sort of abrupt and sort of, jumping into this sort of action bit that's sort of going on here, where they're conversing and playing this sort of game that, has bigger meanings and bigger stakes than you sort of fully understand it. And I think, sometimes that's cool, where you sort of, jump ahead and you're like, oh, okay, so this is what's going to happen. But I don't know. In this case, I think I might sort of agree with you and some of the people that, have commented on your stuff, where it definitely feels like it's not necessarily, needed 100%. It does give you some good characterization. It does give you some information, but I think a lot of it, obviously has to sort of be retreaded, because you have to sort of explain sort of like what actually sort of happened. So yeah, it definitely is really, really short. I think even in the audiobook, this is like the shortest section when I was listening and reading things. It's like 7 minutes or something like that. So it definitely comes across really quick in sort of the grand scheme of things, even though it does have, some information in here, some sort of bits, some sort of, you can see sort of the relationships between sort of the Zongdus here and sort of how they're playing off of each other. But I think you get, even more of this just coming up shortly.
Mm-hmm. So chapter 17 is called Baited, and we immediately cut back to the night before, and we find out, okay, this is what was happening here. It's the planning of the mission that we saw in action in the previous chapter. So they're talking about the whole idea of like, in 6 days, this is when the world leaders will arrive, and that's kind of when things are going to go wrong, because they're expecting the assassination attempt that, of course, Ying Su told Yang Chen about. This is the original plan, and of course Chaixi's going to go back to this. So this is the time they have to work with, so they have to go on the attack, and that means they need information on unanimity. And so they kind of, this is where they focus on the idea of they have to go to like the origin of unanimity. So they need to find out where this training happened and all this sort of stuff. So they're going to get information on Chaici through Zongdu Iwashi, who Chaici has worked with, and they're hoping to get it from basically his documents. And so the plan, as we get here, is that Yangchen and Kavik are going to distract Iwashi directly by playing this sort of gambling game to distract him, while the rest of the team will infiltrate Iwashi's ship, the Bliss Eternal, to get these key documents. Really important that there be some level of like kind of communication, that both missions work perfectly to make this happen. We find that there's kind of an extra layer to the plan as we go forward, but I suppose we'll just focus on this first part initially. So this is sort of the required stuff to explain what on earth the previous chapter was about, if you didn't get what was going on. I don't know, like, do you view that first section as literally just being like the required information, or do you think there's a kind of a bit more to it?
I don't know. A lot of it does feel like it's sort of the required information to sort of, I guess, get you to understand, why they're going to be doing this sort of planning and everything like that. But I think at the same time that, when they sort of, when Jing Chen sort of breaks down her ideas of what's going on, how she needs this sort of information so that she can plan going forward, I don't know, some of it feels like it might not be sort of as necessary. But I mean, I do, for this part of the chapter, the beginning part where they're sort of talking about these plans and sort of how they want to sort of set things up. I think it, does a pretty good idea of setting it up, explaining, a bit of Iwashi and sort of how he views things and sort of, I guess, the broadest sense of things, and as well as just how Yang Chen's been, paying attention to this for quite a while.
hmm The next part is much more interesting because there's a kind of fun aspect to this. So there's a bit of acting, kind of showmanship involved in this next section where we randomly cut to a few hours later. Yang Chen and then Kavik, who's of course disguised as this character Liu, um, they act like a couple in public, like around like everyone, just like giggling through the streets basically, and then really make a kind of show about making it clear that they're kind of climbing in through the window into her room like together, um, and then they purposefully get caught in the morning by the maid, who of course sees like a man in Yang Chen's room, and they want this information to spread because it's like the perfect distraction that everyone will think they have this advantage because they know about Yang Chen's like secret romance when she doesn't care like a single bit about that, and it's the perfect distraction to sort of allow the two to constantly like get information from each other by constantly like looking at each other. So it's a really clever plan here, but they kind of contrast this with like, okay, that they're acting like a couple and they play the role perfectly, but then the second they get away from the public, you see things are a lot more tense between Kavik and Yang Chen. There's tension over the betrayal, and like issues come up about like kind of Kavik in this case pointing out that like I'm doing this for my brother, but like at least my brother sort of like cares about me, whereas like you're putting me in danger doing this, and you're seeing kind of like the tables turn a little bit, where it's not just about Kavik's betrayal, but it's also to a certain extent about like how Yang Chen has in a way approached the friendship, the dynamic with Kavik, and how business-like she made it initially, and that becoming an element of this. So it makes it this very complicated dynamic between the two of them, more than just Kavik betrayed the rest of the group. So what are your thoughts on this kind of fun section where we get the fake kind of romance stuff going on here?
Yeah, I mean, even if it is fake, it is pretty fun. It is cool to see them sort of interact in this more sort of positive way, especially when they're out and stuff, and how they're, pulling the wool over everyone's sort of eyes here, and how Yang Chen is playing this up. And even later on, they play it up even more. So, it's a fun dynamic to actually see, and it gives you, and I think they even mentioned this, that gives it, glimpse into, what might have been if, things sort of went a different way. So it's a nice thing to see. But yeah, like you said, it definitely is, a very harsh contrast towards, how they actually are acting, how they're, pretty split from each other, how they're willing to work together, and they even they work really well together. Like we've seen that from before, and it still continues to be true. It's just unfortunate that they've gotten to the point where there's other parties that are involved in this sort of dynamic that they have to with each other, the White Lotus and his brother, and just sort of the Avatar's duties in general, what her larger goals actually are, that there's no time for this sort of, possible true romance to really sort of develop until, maybe later on, if, all things sort of work out in the sort of best sort of way here. But in terms of their actual goals for this sort of, fake romance, it seems to be working pretty well. I mean, they, make note that, the maid is probably going to tell everyone. And when we do sort of see the other, Zongdus and stuff, you can see how well this sort of play has actually worked.
hmm and then the final part of this chapter is just that they establish that they basically go through like hours and hours of meetings, because like they're not here to play a game. They have to sort of engineer a situation where Iwashi will become interested in playing a game. So everyone just thinks that like Kavik is just this like for some reason Yangchen has decided to bring her new boyfriend to the important business meeting. Is he important in any way? So he's waiting for his moment to shine, and it doesn't seem to be happening. There doesn't seem to be an opening, and Yang Chen's even kind of like making fun of him a little bit at moments like this, where like she blows in his ear and like he goes bright red. But then eventually the moment kind of comes up where some of the Zongdus lose track of the numbers, and Kavik's like, oh, I know the numbers exactly, and he manages to save them like hours of time, and actually save money for some of the Zongdus here. So this gets the attention of Awashi, and so okay, the game is actually going to happen here. He's found someone who could be an interesting player to play against, and that's where we wrap it up. But any thoughts on that kind of final sequence there of this chapter?
Yeah, I thought that was really cool. That was probably, I think, out of this one, after sort of the fake sort of romance, this was the really cool part. I guess it's cool to see the sort of, the plan come together, right? So he's there just, basically chilling on the side with all the other sort of attendants, and he even gets sort of the initial sort of brush off by Chai Si, right? So we're sort of okay, she doesn't recognize him and all that sort of stuff. So, the whole cover part there seems to be working as far as they understand. And that was something that, him and Yang Chen sort of discussed, multiple times ahead, to see if this would even work in that sort of regard. But he never, as far as they know, he never got that high up where he was at that sort of notice point. But yeah, to see the actual sort of, conversation go down here between the Zongdus, to see how, they're sort of interacting in this sort of, public-ish setting where they're sort of making these deals and trying to basically determine the fate of, their respective areas that they control, right? How that's going to, affect, going forward towards the years, and when they actually have the rulers there, how they're going to sort of, discuss, those going ons and stuff like that. So to see, Kavik in his sort of disguised role come out here, sort of, get attention to himself, even though, they make note that, sort of the attendants, they never sort of want to, have attention drawn themselves, because, they're obviously, stature-wise very, low compared to, the Zongdus, right? Or the Avatar, of course, as well. So, it was cool to see that, and how that's sort of the main, ploy here that sort of gets him invited in the game. That's sort of been their whole, the whole baited point of this chapter here. So I thought that was really cool to see the plan come together there, and have them have that sort of, at least initial moment of success here, even though there's still a lot more to go.
And then it is interesting to look back on like Chai Si's involvement in these chapters, because she isn't the focus of most of what goes on there. There's a few scenes here or there, but really she doesn't stand out as much. But then you realize, based on reveals from later on in the book, she does know it's Kavik the whole time. She just like acts like she doesn't, because based on something we'll find out somewhat soon, Kalyan has actually told the full truth to Chai Si. So there's some interesting stuff with that as well. But we'll move on to the next chapter, chapter 18, Hooked. So they're basically heading to the room where they're going to play, but just before they get there, they look at some of Awashi's art pieces, and Yang Chen's a little bit startled by like how friendly Chai Si and Iwashi are, and how casually they discuss like, oh, this piece of art is fake. It almost feels unfair to her that like these two kind of pseudo world leaders actually kind of get on like this, and it isn't this kind of massive politic game the whole time. But we get an interesting scene here that is kind of interesting for a few reasons. One of the particular pieces of art is this blood lacquer table, which startles Yang Chen and Kavik, because of course it looks like it's covered in blood, but it's actually just this kind of lacquer that is colored like blood. And so there's the initial visual shock, but then Yang Chen notices that it's actually made from a foggy swamp tree. And that's the thing that nearly makes like Yang Chen go a little bit Avatar state here over this, because this like potentially hundreds of years old tree was taken down to make this random table. We also find out that Awashi only plays with large amounts of money, so this is where the whole idea of Yangchen will be forced to use the budget of Bin to play. And it really, the mission starts to get questioned a little bit here. Should they be doing this or not? This is a lot to risk. But then Iwashi reveals that he actually has bought Yangchen's glider staff, which was sold off in the earlier chapters to make money, and Kabuk would like to win that back, so that kind of comes up. Chai-Si puts a rare black pearl up for as part of this as well, and that will be a kind of thing to remember for one of the reveals later on. She mentions that she got this from one of her first dives on like her home island, so some interesting details in all of this. And that's like the kind of opening section of this chapter. Again, these two chapters in particular are quite long. But what are your thoughts on that opening?
Yeah, I really like all the little hints towards what's going to happen in the future. I think those parts feel a lot sort of, I guess, integrated and more natural than sort of the sort of flash forward and sort of flashback. So I like this one because it definitely, it sets, it does a good job of setting the stage of what's actually going to happen while still keeping it more sort of, story focused and forward sort of driven here. I mean, there's a couple sort of shock moments here for our characters here. The whole thing with the blood lacquer I thought was pretty interesting, and how that sort of threw them for a loop, or specifically Yangchen, how not only does she sort of almost go into sort of the Avatar spirit, but even sort of her past lives through that sort of kick in, and Kavik has to sort of cover for her eventually, to sort of let her sort of get her sort of bearing here. And it's interesting to see references back to the Foggy Swamp tribe. I think even though this is still sort of like a random thing that is sort of happening along the lines with anything else that's happened in the book, but to have that reference and to have that feel like it's part of this, and them sort of these rich leaders just sort of being, I guess, rich leaders in this sort of situation, that seemed like sort of the back end sort of dealing way that these things might sort of go down, even though it's completely sort of at odds with Yangchen, and she, even here, sort of like self-berates herself on terms of like what the White Lotus would say to her, and sort of the situation in terms of this, you gotta get it done and deal with it in this sort of situation. I think there's, a lot that could be, I guess, glimpsed from these sort of, casual conversations that these leaders, Zongdus, are actually having.
Mm-hmm. The final conversation they have before they start the game is quite interesting, because they start to gossip a little bit. And so one of the first things Chai-Si says is that she reveals that she knows that the Sewon clan are fortifying their strongholds to try and gain a sort of advantage while they're still in their weakened state. Now, this is obviously a reference back to the stuff with the Sewon clan from the first Yangchen novel, where Yangchen had to create a second deal that would weaken the clan for like generations upon generations, so they're not allowed to be involved in like Fire Nation politics basically like at all. So Yangchen notes that like even though this is technically not breaking the deal, she is frustrated by the fact that they can't just they can't just exist and just be happy that they haven't ruined their island because they broke the deal in the first place. The fact that they still are striving to try and gain some sort of an advantage when they really shouldn't be, just makes her question the effort that she puts in to actually create these deals in the first place. So this brings up the whole idea of like Chai-Si's opinion on how to lead, how she kind of views her people in a way. She says that you can't ask people to change. No lesson is ever truly learned except through pain, which definitely fits the more kind of cruel kind of side of things with Chai-Si, where she just basically disposes of people when they go against her. She doesn't care if they kind of change or not. She just, if you do something against her, she will deal with it. That's her approach. And then Iwashi gives his opinion. So he talks about how he threw this event when he first became the Zongdu of Taku. And the people afterwards, it was a huge success, told him that his event was better than any event thrown by the previous Zongdu. And it seems like a pretty minor comment, but Yangchen kind of begins to sweat a little bit, because I think she knows where this is going. He notes that he hated the way that he was graded by the people. And basically, after this slight against him, he made this decision to never waste any energy on the people ever again going forward. And so he just completely acts like someone who is just completely above all the people of Taku, that he basically kind of leads over. His decisions kind of affect them, but he doesn't actually care about them. And Yangchen, of course, disagrees with the intent here, but the whole book has been leading up to the idea that this hits home for Yangchen much harder than you would think, and that those ideas of like giving up on people, and what if you did just completely back away and just treat it as the people aren't worth having a good leader, what would actually happen? Because she's dealing with that as the current like leader of Bin but also as the Avatar in its leadership position, and we've dealt with a lot of that already with the Avatar Goon scene and stuff like that. It's a super interesting one, like thematically, for Yangchen to be in the middle of the other leaders, and to kind of in a way see what she would become if she made one of these kind of harsh choices to step away as a leader and really look down on the people. So I think this is a really strong character kind of side of the chapter, seeing the leaders discuss things. But what are your thoughts on this section?
Yeah, it is very strong. I think it drives home the idea of, what it is to be sort of a leader, and, how to lead people, and how to sort of, care for the people without, maybe investing too much or losing too much of yourself, or putting in, too much energy, which is, Yangchen, she's always about sort of, the action and moving forward, and sort of, maybe caring a little bit too much about people, or giving people too much sort of leeway, which, by the end of this sort of section we're covering, we'll see, how low that can sort of take her as a character. And, it's just here she still is having, some sort of hope that, things can sort of come out on the more sort of positive sides. But I think you can definitely see sort of the effect that the story, mostly from Iwashi, has on Yangchen, in terms of how, he was received, how it didn't really matter, and how, just sort of the next sort of week or whatever, he was sort of looked down upon, something that he, had almost like no control over actually sort of happening here. So it's definitely, it's interesting to see this sort of, I guess you could say, like, commiseration between leaders here that, don't necessarily get along with each other. Like, they sort of play up the sort of idea that, Yangchen and Chai-Si are sort of, okay to be around, but not really, they really are at sort of ends, even though they're trying to sort of keep up this sort of pseudo appearance here. And Iwashi, he seems like he's, he's aware of things, but he's almost sort of in his own sort of world, because he's also, sort of already sort of well established even before being sort of a Zongdu, which they sort of make note of, that, this is sort of, it's almost sort of like a side thing that he's sort of doing here. And, Kavik is here just sort of, sort of being here as like almost sort of an observer, yet, is able to sort of ask questions in certain situations. So it's definitely sort of a complicated sort of situation to be in for Yangchen, and just sort of pushing her along towards, making decisions that she doesn't necessarily agree with, but has to sort of do in this sort of moment.
Mm-hmm. Then we go into chapter 19, which is Landed. There's a small bit at the end of the previous chapter, which is where we kind of catch up with the initial chapter that started this sequence, with the idea of like they technically lose the game entirely on the first hand, and are forced to kind of raise the stakes even higher to actually, stay in the game. So by the time you come into this chapter, they've lost like multiple times in a row. And as we see here, they have a break, and Kavik lets Yangchen know kind of secretly that, hey, Iwashi is just cheating. He's using every trick in the book to cheat. That's why we're losing. And Yangchen is panicking, but Kavik is like, I can turn this around. I was just waiting for a few things to happen, including him to get a little bit more sweaty, because he's going to start to counter cheat now going forward. But there is a big discussion about, like, should they continue? And in a way, can Yangchen kind of like trust Kavik to be this, competent person to get this done, And because of how badly things have gone, she kind of is forced to once again put her trust in him. But this time it actually works out, because once he does start to counter cheat, they kind of make all their money back. And this is where you see the whole Iwashi's obsession with money thing coming out. He starts to just raise the stakes even higher himself, and basically loses everything, as we see here. Yangchen gets involved in it as well, you know, slipping him like the right tile that he needs, secretly like under the table. And again, they get away with this because everyone else just views it as like the two kind of young characters in a relationship, unable to keep their eyes off each other, when they're actually like communicating like quite heavily with this stuff. So at this point, yeah, like he's lost pretty much everything. But then this is basically where the signal comes in. There's smoke from his ship. This is the signal to end the game, which ends automatically because he wants to go down to his ship, because this is like his most important thing here. So it's basically a success on both sides here. They've distracted him long enough, but there's actually the other net benefit of like they've gained a lot of money from Iwashi as well. So that's a benefit for Bin as well. But yeah, that is that chapter. That's how we kind of like turn things around overall, with the game kind of ending like this. And I forget where exactly it is, but like they note that even though Chicey was playing the game, she ends the game like equal. Like she didn't lose any money, she didn't gain any money. She loses her black pearl basically. But that's the only thing that she actually loses. Otherwise, she was basically just watching everyone else play the entire time. And it's this really subtle moment throughout the whole thing that you barely realize that the main villain wasn't really up to much there, but she was in so much control, basically just wanting to see, I suppose, Iwashi get ruined, because I think we shortly find out that like she basically takes up most of his debt and kind of controls him after. But what are your thoughts on this chapter as the kind of game sequence comes to?
Yeah, this is another one where the plan comes together, and I think the chapter does a good job of, after the initial shock of, they're being cheated, and, Kavak has sort of a plan in mind to actually, succeed with, sort of getting back at Iwashi and everything that he's been doing. I think, it lines up pretty quickly, and it seems like they're having fun at this point after, Yangchen gets over the shock of like losing all of Ben's money and, being even more in debt. Once they sort of break even and actually gain up at the end, they're able to sort of like trade jabs back and forth here, which Iwashi, you can see he's from Kavak's original estimation that he's sort of just a bully with money and sort of dealings, and he doesn't really want sort of a real competition or anything like that. They sort of pretty much have him made at that point. It's almost like too easy for them, being sort of benders and having this ability to sort of rig the game in their favor, that apparently, as far as we know, or at least as far as they're playing into it, Chicey or Iwashi aren't aware of what's sort of actually happening here, from like the heating of the room to sort of Kavak and his sort of skills. So definitely it plays on sort of their abilities and techniques that they've sort of learned over time, and how that works towards their advantage in this game. So I don't know, it's interesting how this game works in itself, which I don't think I fully comprehend, but I think it's cool how they at least describe it in the book, how there's certain terms and how it's so mathematical and how it plays out, and how that sort of I guess sort of makes it fun in some sense to actually be playing, if you have, I guess, competent sort of opponents, which I guess in this way they were a little bit too competent for Iwashi and sort of his likes and his favors. But yeah, it's definitely a fun chapter in terms of it turning out well for the good guys, I guess, in this case.
Mm-hmm. We go into chapter 20, anonymity, not unanimity. And we get an interesting one right off the start, like a little interesting Chai-Si scene. She says, this is where she actually gives up the black pearl, and she says, to the winner go the spoils. Avatar, hang on tight to your companion. A worthy partner comes by once in a generation. And this is a really interesting line to look back on, given that she actually did know it was Kavak the entire time, and it and because I suppose she's maybe heard the rumors herself about like they're in a relationship, quote unquote, um, it is an interesting one of kind of being like, hey, I'm in a relationship with his brother, like this family's good kind of type thing. It's a bit interesting to kind of look back on, but um, we do go from there to basically the team celebrating their victory here. We just get a really kind of quick thing of just like, Kavik and Yangchen celebrating. They then have to kind of go back on. They have to still keep up their act, so they have to go off together back to where they're staying. And when they get back, they are confronted by Kalyan. So we get the kind of surprise reveal that Kalyan is in here, and he wants to speak to Yangchen specifically about something. He wants to kind of force her to do something here. And he basically, he congratulates them on their success against Iwashi, but does warn them that doing that, it won't work against Chai-Si. And again, he says, let Chai-Si win. Yangchen thinks she has a pretty good chance in this situation. She is the Avatar, so she refuses, because she can just take out Kalyan here, can't she? But Kalyan has the edge here because he gestures outside and reveals that, you didn't know this, but I've known it for a while, that guy over there, it's Earth King Feishan in disguise, and I have Tail over here right next to him, ready to eliminate him if required. And so this forces Yangchen's hand. She didn't know about this situation. And in a way, after all of this, we kind of do finally get down to business. What Kalyan wants is for Yangchen to cut Kavik loose. Basically, stop using him as part of your team, as well as, basically stop guilt tripping him into like following you and making him think that he owes you, that sort of an idea. He mentions that like he himself has done everything to protect Kavik while she continues to put him in danger. So after all of this, he's just like, you know what you need to do, like leave him out of this. He leaves. Yangchen rushes to follow, but Kavik starts like punching the wall, screaming in frustration about how like his brother, is always, better than him, and Yangchen has to stay behind to help heal his hand. So it's a very emotional kind of scene here, because of course the whole time through, again, you note that the typical dynamic between the brothers is that like Kavik was in the room but basically wasn't involved in the conversation, even though the conversation was like about him. Like that's the way that relationship is between these two, that he just gets talked about even though he's right there. And then what Kalyan says, kind of like what Iwashi says, it does hit Yangchen, because it does force her to realize that like, yes, I probably haven't handled the Kavik relationship the best either. But what is also interesting about this scene is that everything that Kalyan says about Yangchen also applies to like Kalyan's own approach towards his brother. That like he basically has loyalty from his brother because Kalyan guilt trips him, and it seems to be implied here this has been the case like their entire life, that this is the entire dynamic between these two. And he doesn't seem able to see it, and this is part of the interesting characterization, especially in the last third of the book with Kalyan, and like he has this almost obsession about like keeping his family together, but then doesn't like treat Kavik like well at all, but will do anything to protect him. It's very, very interesting what drives this character. It seems like this massive like contradiction, but like it works. You just are very confused about like how things ended up this way almost. But what are your thoughts on this chapter here? Kalyan gets a big appearance here.
Yeah, Kylan is definitely this is probably like the most sort of like real characterization that I think we get from him, and his sort of dynamics and his, ideas on how, he thinks he should be, protecting his family, all of his family, even if we, at this point in time in the story, we don't know everyone that's actually part of his family here. But yeah, the dynamic that he has with his brother, between the two brothers here, is definitely, I don't know, it feels almost sort of sometimes like your sort of like standard little brother sort of type of syndrome, always trying to look up to the older one. But it's a lot more, I guess you could say, manipulative, which is, what you're sort of going on with, Yang Chen, and sort of, how she, essentially to some regard is, could she really be sort of like emotionally sort of blackmailing Kavik to sort of work with her, which, the whole, their whole sort of being together is sort of, based on sort of agreements and conditions regardless. So is there even more to her actually pulling him along these sort of lines here? And how does she sort of, reconcile with dealing with that? And, it's, such a up and down sort of feeling for this chapter, or just, this whole part of the book at this point, because they really did just have a successful mission. And almost seemed like for a second there, and they mention it in the book here, that she, they sort of, almost sort of forgot that they were sort of really at ends with each other. So it doesn't last too long for them to sort of be brought sort of down to earth here, and with King Feishan sort of in the sort of wake here, trying to sort of scout things out ahead of time, just because he has to sort of believe it on his own here. It puts everyone sort of at odds and at angles here, because they didn't sort of expect this. Although, it seems like, I don't know, it almost seems like you should have expected this from King Feishan, considering how he sort of met with Yang Chen before, and how sort of secretive he seems to be. And I guess you almost sort of can't blame him to some regard for being this way with the whole thing with the Platinum Affair, right? So that was like a huge ordeal, and everyone was sort of betraying between whole nations here. So it almost sort of makes sense that he would have to sort of see it for himself. It just unfortunate that he puts him in such a dangerous position without even knowing it himself, right? Like, he's just there sort of chilling at a restaurant here, where there's other people that are also tailing him. So clearly he's not as good as he thinks he is, and it seems like the only person who's really as good as they think they are is Kailan here, because he seems to be able to avoid pretty much everyone, or always has a plan. Even the way that he leaves this sort of interrogation here is out through sort of the normal door of their place that they're staying here, without having any sort of issue, and is even able to walk past the Earth King. So it definitely shows his competence and his sort of ability here, that he really is sort of the better one of the two of them as of now, out of the two brothers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the final sentence in that chapter is kind of interesting, because it applies to quite a few people in the book. There was no weakness as great as family. In this case, it's talking about like Kavik, and in a way, was he in a way in punching the wall to keep Yang Chen back, protecting his brother in a way, or was it just this moment of like frustration about the way their relationship is? But then you realize that, oh yeah, this is sort of Kalyan making a kind of a play entirely just to save his brother, so completely out of a sense of like family. So it speaks to, this is obviously the way to actually defeat this character. He kind of in a way doesn't realize that this is his weakness, like Kavik is his weakness. He hasn't quite realized that yet, but we'll get to that in like the final third of the book. Next we have chapter 21, which is called Keeping Pace. So we find out that yes, Kavik's hand has been healed. They bring the rest of the team up to speed on what actually happened. And there's some back and forth here. They all criticize Kalyan, and make notes about how, oh, your whole family must be like this. We will consider them the same as Feishan, but Kavik's like, hey, my parents are nice. But this all builds up to basically how Yang Chen figures out where they need to go. Like her effectively interpreting the data that they got from the ship, and basically it's just like kind of shipping lanes and sort of stuff, and realizing that, okay, she's working with Iwashi to organize stuff to get to supplies to go to this island. There's no island listed on this map, so it has to be in this blank small area of sea here, and that's the only thing that can explain it. And it makes a lot of logical sense, and this is what they're going to do. And then basically it's just the plan, which is that Akudan and Taegum are going to stay behind, and Yangchen is going to bring the two boys with her as a kind of a bonding exercise to try and fix their relationship with her to go to the island here. So this is definitely more of a kind of transition chapter where we mostly just go to set up the next couple of important chapters. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a nice, lull in the pace of everything that's going because, it's been sort of very fast, very action oriented, and you sort of need a second to sort of take stock of everything that's sort of happened and sort of, figure out and disseminate the information that they have, which is, what Yang Chen does here. And, she does make a note that I think here that she kept it to herself and she's been at this for quite a long time, which is why she sort of has come to these conclusions here. And, we've, heard, as, readers of this, that, there is some sort of, mysterious island that, Chai-Si, has somewhere. So even Awashi is sort of aware of that something of this sort of exists, but he doesn't know the purpose. He doesn't know anything along those sort of lines. He just knows that there's something there. And, they know sort of Chai-Si's backstory and from where she's from so that she would have this sort of, knowledge and information, although we don't know to what degree unless you're really sort of, I guess, in the know, I suppose. But yeah, it's a good one to just sort of take stock of things and to see where they're going. And, I like how they sort of play up the idea of, them sort of coming together as sort of a pseudo forced bonding experience in order to sort of rectify, things that have happened before, even though it clearly doesn't look like it's going to work because Kavik and Jiu-Jitsu are still at odds with each other.
Mm-hmm. And then we probably should mention at this point that because of reveals from later on in the book, the previous 6 or so chapters is actually something that didn't need to happen because of a reveal we'll get later on in the book. Yang Chen already knows where the island is, and this is just sort of a public way where people will see where she's got the information on where the island actually is. And it obviously means that a lot of the tension of some of those scenes is taken out a little bit, or at least the lengths that Yang Chen went through to put them through such a tense situation just to keep this grander plan up, the true secret kind of ace in the hole that she has. It is interesting going back through the book and kind of realizing that, because the tension is really high throughout a lot of these scenes. She is at the risk of losing the whole budget of Bin but knowing that she already has the information here and this is just the ultimate sort of distraction. It's an interesting one to consider. And again, it's the sort of details, the mysteries, the reveals kind of being told a little bit out of sequence. Again, that is an example of a reveal where it works getting that reveal later on. But you can see the different layerings of all of these, the sequence that didn't need to happen also was told a bit out of sequence for no real reason. But what are your thoughts on that, going back to that whole gambling sequence and then based on the later reveal that it was just actually a fake mission to a certain degree?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fake mission with a purpose, right? Because she's still trying to sort of hide things even from her own team right at this point. So she's not really, she's not 100% trusting of, almost anyone at this point. And even though she knows things already, where things are in terms of the island stuff, she still has to sort of, show that there's some sort of real sort of paper trail, I guess you could say, in order to actually get to the point where she wants to be. I mean, if it didn't work, I'm sure she probably had some sort of backup for it. But, the scenes themselves, even if the overall sort of, I guess, tension of they have to get to, through the ship and everything in order to get the information, in order to find out where the place is particularly, could be lessened a bit. The idea of that, the whole thing, like you're saying, with the budget and everything, that's still very real there. If they lost that money, Ben-Hur would still be, in worse for wear in terms of, their situation and stuff. So there's, it's tension, but it's in a different place and it doesn't have sort of the grander scheme, maybe, implications that you think it might have. But I think if she didn't, go through with those different steps, it would still hamper her and sort of goals and observations that she had because, essentially, maybe she wouldn't have had, the extra day to actually go check out the island where she would have found out all this extra information that she actually had. So, there's different ways, I guess, you could look at it depending on, how it might have been so successful for her end sort of goal here. But, there's other things that, might have survived or, other companions that might have survived if she didn't have to go there in those sort of ways. So there's so many different layers to it, like you're saying.
And then there is one final part of chapter 21, and that is just this. It's a little bit of a plot point you can track throughout the book. It's Kavik, while they're preparing for the mission, ends up like trying a tiny bit of the leftover tea that Yangchen was having, and he basically nearly has like a heart attack from just how kind of energy boosting it actually is. And this, of course, causes him to worry about like Yangchen's health, which has obviously been a plot point in the book already about she's not really sleeping a lot. And then we've seen moments where she is downing this tea quite a lot to stay up. But now he has tried it, and basically the idea is that like a normal person is nearly like overloaded with the level of like energy he's getting from this tea. This is how she is like surviving in a way, keeping going, is this spirit tea, of course, which is meant to kind of boost you for a trip to the spirit world, but she's using as just like an energy drink type thing. But it's an interesting end where he realizes that he can't tell the rest of the team that like he's worried for Yang health because the mission is so important to her, and he, in a way, he views it as like, if I did that, would that be a sort of betrayal of her, where like the team would step in and maybe try to slow her down. That would get in the way of like what she's all about, which is trying to accomplish things. And so he stays quiet, but he's kind of the only one who's kind of aware of just how much she's over pushing herself. It's just a little interesting thing to follow, in that we've already had the little moment where like he's kind of like guarded over her when she does finally go to sleep, and now he knows the kind of truth about like her overusing this kind of tea. But what are your thoughts on this final little sequence here?
Yeah, I think this is pretty, important to, how Yang Shen's sort of operating as a character. And, it just shows you at this point how driven she is, I guess, towards her actual goals here. And it was, pretty interesting how they sort of described, the whole sort of energy boost that he had. And he didn't even have that much. He had like her dregs, I think they said, in terms of, the amount of leftover tea that she gave him to sort of dispose of. It almost makes you wonder if she was like doing that as a ploy, considering everything else that, she's done in this sort of story here. Because he seems to be, even reluctantly sort of the closest one with her, in terms of, what he knows about her, the whole thing with the banishment from the temples and stuff like that. So, there's a lot that sort of goes on with that, but it's just another one of those things where you can't really say anything, and these are probably like the only things that he's sort of kept to himself from sort of the White Lotus and his sort of overall sort of report thing. So he is sort of holding some things in close regard, and hopes that he will have a better favorable outcome at the end of things.
Mm-hmm. Next is chapter 22. So in this one, we're kind of actually heading out here. There's a fun little moment at the start where we have Kavik and Jujinta sort of like competing for Nujian's attention. And Jujinta wins this round because he actually has some food for Nujian, and Kavik's like, you were cheating doing that. But Yangchen steps in between them and is just like, hey, there's only one person he's really loyal to. I could get him to attack you if you want. So that's pretty fun. But then they're kind of on their way. They're discussing things. Again, Kavik and Jujinta seem to be arguing over basically everything. But then the conversation switches to like, hey, we kind of all know each other's pasts, except we don't really know the details about you, Jujinta. Why don't you tell us like what actually happened in your past? Like there's some island that you're from, the Yuyan stuff. Like what actually happened there? And he thinks about it, but then decides not to. And they both kind of are like, surely you're not like banished from there, exiled from there forever. There's always some way to kind of reverse it in some way, but he's like, no, I can't, and this is why I won't tell you, is because there's no hope at all for me to kind of go back. And he kind of gets, it's for one of the first times you see Jujinta get really, really like emotional, where he actually like kind of shouts at Yangchen as well, and he's like pointing out like their situations of just like, you know, I don't like you, Kavik, because you think you can just kind of like waltz back in here and, you know, be good with the rest of the team. You don't know basically what I've been through being kind of banished from my home. And then with Yang Chen kind of pointing out that like you're welcome anywhere. You don't know what it's like to be like severed from your roots. And they note that there's a little bit of like Jujinta doesn't know their situations fully himself, where Yang Chen has been exiled from one of the temples and has like issues with her home temple as well. And then Kavik is in a very weird situation where like he's not really safe in his home in the north or in Bin-Er because politically, I suppose, based on what he knows, people are after him. It's not safe for him to just be in either of those places. And so it's just a very kind of like, oh, this got very serious all of a sudden. But then the island comes into view. They eventually do find it, and you know, we're here basically. It's obviously a frustrating chapter because we don't really get Jujinta's backstory. We will get like allusions to things that happened in the upcoming chapters, but not directly in the way that it maybe could have been here. And I think because we don't really learn anything super significant in addition to what we already knew, it makes this chapter feel like a real like tease for no real reason. When why didn't he just say something? You kind of, in that like there's no third book as far as we're aware. So when are we ever going to find out about this? Like this is obviously the really kind of confusing, concerning kind of thing, is that the word Yuyan is never once brought up in this book. And I think everyone expected, at least to a certain extent, that we would learn something specifically about what's going on here, but we didn't. So the first of probably quite a few things in the book where detail-wise they just decide to be like, nope, we're not telling you anything. But what are your thoughts on this chapter here?
Yeah, I definitely can see how that can be a bit frustrating. I think maybe some of the other stuff might even be more so than that. But yeah, with them not mentioning, I guess directly to Yuyans, I guess you're trying to sort of be left up in the air in terms of, is this really it? Is this some other sort of, I guess group that sort of functions like that? I mean, I think, for most people, it leads itself to believe what it actually seems to be here. But it is, too bad. And, they make note of this, that, the truth is hard, and it's hard to sort of, let that out in the situation. And there's too much, I guess, sort of build up, between their relationships here to really, for them to be, that sort of trusting. Like they definitely make it seem like, almost that he could break, that he would actually share something, but, it's just not. They're not at that point. It definitely feels like, something that maybe could happen sort of later on. But, as far as we know, there's nothing more, at least in terms of this, that we're going to be hearing about. So, yeah, it does beg the question, where might we hear this story going forward? But, I mean, I don't know. There are other projects in the works. Maybe something like that will come out later on. It definitely seems like it's definitely not anytime soon for sure in that. But I don't know. I definitely could see why this would irk people a bit, because it seems like they're almost so close to sort of a breakthrough, and the whole idea of, the chapter be called bonding and stuff like that. But, there's no real sort of bond sort of formed here at all. I think it's, just sort of a leeway to them towards getting to the island.
Mm-hmm. And then we get into chapter 23, Circumstantial Evidence. And this has obviously been a chapter we've been waiting for a while. We're finally here on the island where unanimity was kind of trained, created, whatever way you want to call it. This is where we're hoping a lot of reveals happen because of all the teases from the first book about, what the training was, combustion bending. And so, of course, it's cautious initially, because they don't know that, like, they won't encounter like an island like just filled with combustion benders. Like if they just fly normally over the island, who's to say they won't get hit with like 20 combustion blasts? Like it is a possibility. So they kind of sneak in, they land at the shore. Again, they're very cautious, kind of making their way up from there. But they're noticing for the most part that there's nothing really going on. They arrive at a bunch of kind of huts where there's like basically it's a barracks where people are doing some sort of training. And what they get from this is that, like, okay, there's some clearly non-bender training stuff going on here. They pick up a scroll and realize that, oh, without saying it directly, like the takeaway as a fan, if you know your stuff, should be chi blocking training is going on here. So you immediately get this idea that this island isn't entirely just about combustion bending, but actually a training facility for effectively some sort of a like private army of specially trained benders and fighters. That like here's the special non-benders, the chi blockers, and you know it's this. They really describe it as like this kind of conveyor belt type system where they're literally just trying to like produce people with talents. Like it is not the same as like a dojo of people training to become skilled at a martial art. It's this very forced kind of aspect to it. And as we kind of go forward kind of through this, we get a lot of kind of mentions of kind of stuff like this. It's this and the kind of like next chapter basically where we learn quite a bit about kind of what's going on here. And then they kind of move on from there and make their way to like further through the island, and they find this like kind of small kind of mountain area, and there's like a tunnel inside with like a door. And so when they go in here, they realize like, wait, what's the whole idea about that? It's really difficult to get in, and they realize, oh, it's meant to keep people inside. And so we learn about this area where there's these iron hoops. Then they uncover that there's a chair with restraints on it, and this suddenly makes the characters react in a very kind of emotional, kind of violent way. They leave, Kavik gets sick, and the result of this is that within a couple of minutes, everyone's outside, and Yangchen just like earth bends this place into like oblivion. She like destroys what this place actually is. And this is a very interesting one here because the connection, you can make it. And to some extent, like, you know, again, if you know your stuff, you can make the connection and it's clear enough. But I think a lot of people will miss what they're going for with this because it's just vaguely worded and stuff like this. But this is the idea. This is where the brainwashing takes place. The metal hoops are meant to be the thing that the light spins around on to actually brainwash people who sit in the chair. But this is where it's really unclear about, like, are the characters just reacting to it being a place where people went through like bad stuff, or do they know specifically it's brainwashing? There's just like a very heavy reaction to this place without the acknowledgement of what exactly is going on here. And that's kind of a lot of what this first kind of chapter is really about. So what are your thoughts on how they do these kind of initial reveals on the island?
That's a good point. I mean, I think, I don't know, it was, I guess pretty clear to me what's going on, but, we've been talking and watching this stuff for a while now, so I definitely can see how that could be easily sort of missed here. I think, from the character's perspective, at least for this instance, right, when they're sort of dealing with the chair and the hoops and everything like that, it definitely feels like it's more of a visceral response to what they're seeing there, and less sort of the actual, I guess, active process of what they're doing there. At least that's how I interpreted that part of the story. Because, I mean, I don't know, as far as we know or anything that they've said, we don't know that they have, as much sort of, I guess, experience with the brainwashing directly, as far as we know, or as far as the story has told us. So I don't see it being sort of that being their response. But, you can see them each take, it in sort of a different way of the magnitude of what's happening there, and just sort of the the blood and the stuff, and just their sort of description of the chair and how the people, whoever were there, struggled in those, in that sort of situation there. So I don't know. It feels like it's more along those lines. Even, Jujinta, who, is probably, I guess you could say, the best for wear of, being, out of this sort of, place that he, even from, I think, the beginning of when they first started exploring this island, he was like, we should not be here. Even though, if we recall, it was him originally who said, he agrees with the Avatar and that, we should, go on this sort of trip here. Even though, Kavik was, of course, at ends with that, which who knows if that was because he was just at ends with Juzinto or just because the idea might not necessarily be that good one. But I think, at this point, they've all realized that this was, something that they hadn't quite sort of expected, even though they've, gained more and more understanding of this, island, its factory likeness, its training facilities, and it only gets, sort of worse from here. And, the Avatar has, I think, it doesn't seem like it's sort of like a Avatar spirit sort of, I guess sort of reaction to this, even though the I guess ability wise is almost at that sort of strength lies when she sort of destroys this sort of, mini facility here in order to brainwash people. So it's definitely, a pretty, I guess, intense scene overall, regardless of if you understand the magnitude of what's actually happening.
Yeah, like the more and more I read this one, the more and more like I definitely think it's needlessly vague for being the kind of like we've discovered the island. We're actually in the process of delivering quote unquote reveals. Doing this is the brainwashing facility is a bit weird just because especially the iron hoops thing. Like I think it's if they didn't focus on the chair later, I don't know most fans make the connection about what's actually going on here just from the whole iron hoop idea. So and especially with little moments like this was to say here. Yeah, Kavik, he needed a moment to fully comprehend the object he just unveiled. Oh no, 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 no. And it's like, oh, so do you know what it is? No. And it again, it's that idea of the takeaway by the end has to be that no one here knows that it's a brainwashing facility. But then why the reaction that is so heavy? Because, okay, they describe it, they say like the seed had been stained dark by foulness, but they don't say it's like blood. Like this would feel like a good response if this was like literally like a quote unquote actual torture chamber. Now, I suppose you could say the brainwashing is a form of torture to a certain degree, but the level of like them basically calling this place evil when they don't actually know what it is, I don't like the way they did the presentation or kind of lack of presentation in this one here. I get it. This is the circumstantial evidence chapter. It's the primary source chapter next. This is meant to be more the vagueness. But like I said earlier, I don't even think brainwashing plays that big of a role in the book overall. So it feels like a bit of a kind of thrown in element to just make more of what's going on the island when I think you could have done this whole thing without it. Just because by the end of the book there isn't really much of a takeaway about the brainwashing, where like it doesn't come up really in relation to like Thapa, except that like Yangchen notices he's out of it a little bit. It's just not referenced when it comes to like Ying Su or like this being a potential threat going forward. I just feel like there's some weirdness surrounding some of this stuff at this stage in the book where some decisions were sort of made or not made to how much should we reveal about what we're actually like doing here. And I feel they leaned really heavily into the side of we're not actually going to like reveal anything significant. And it feels kind of like brainwashing gets added in because we need something else. Because the combustion mending, we're not actually explaining it properly. But we'll go on because we kind of have to group this together with the chapter 24 primary sources, where we get more concrete information because we actually get to meet two characters who are part of basically Project Unanimity. So they walk away from where they just were, and they realize they're being followed. And so behind them, out of nowhere, have appeared this young boy and young girl about the same age. And there's some initial interesting stuff here where like Yangchen and Kavik try to be really nice to them, but they're super on edge, and Jujinta's kind of like, I wouldn't try and like go too close to them, and Kavik gets like chi blocked. So the girl is revealed to be a chi blocker, and Kavik just gets kind of pretty badly chi blocked here with what happens. So they're forced to kind of chase down these two kids then, and once they finally kind of manage to calm them down, which actually happens through Jujinta doing his quote-unquote reveal of his backstory here by pointing out that, I get it. What I went through on my home island was actually very similar to what's happening here. It was kind of run in this way as like this kind of training kind of facility type thing where you have to compete against everyone else, you have to make the cut. If you don't make the cut, you're effectively like eliminated. And that's what he kind of points out here. We know you've been through a lot, but we will rescue you, we will protect you, you won't have to answer for the horrible deeds that I know you've committed to survive. And he gets them like, shaking, crying, but this is what gets them to actually kind of open up. It's one of Jujinta's best scenes in the book, but again, it still leaves like exactly what he actually went through a bit of a mystery, because it alludes to some stuff about like, okay, so the Yuyan work in this way to a certain extent, but it doesn't tell you anything about like why or how he ended up killing his brother and all of that stuff. But what are your thoughts on this with the introduction of these two new characters, Raite and Xian? I'm not sure about the pronunciation on her name, even though I've listened to the audiobook multiple times. It's just a very difficult name to pronounce.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, I think the initial here, after they get over sort of, I guess, the horrors of sort of the brainwashing thing is I guess it's cool to see, or interesting to see, that there is two occupants there that are even younger than most of our heroes, which are already pretty young. So there's that sort of dynamic that they have in play here, but they're still at odds and ends here because they've gone through such a traumatic experience here, and I think it's it is the nicer, the cool part to see Jujin to have more of a standout moment here, even if it isn't really sort of his sort of backstory that we might have hoped for. But I think it isn't really, I don't know, even though it would be cool to have more information about him, the story isn't about him per se, and I guess in terms of character story hierarchy, he might be on the lower end of it, even though it would be really cool. But I like that he has this sort of connection with these newfound characters that is able to sort of I guess bridge the gap, and he almost sort of like shrugs off that he's able to sort of get them to sort of open off here by throwing it back at them that you guys are the better at talking, sort of acts away your sort of questions here. So he's still showing his, I guess, sort of I guess slight superiority, even though he's working with the group towards this goal of helping these kids sort of open up and I guess sort of in their own sort of way come to terms with what they've actually had to do here. So it's a good first half of getting to understand the actual things that happen at this island.
Mm-hmm. Then we get, this is actually like the core reveal about Project Unanimity here. This is where they actually revealed the most information, even though there's probably still a lot that probably should have been explained. But what we get here is that how these two kids came to join this project was that they are from different villages all along the Natsuo Island chain. So that was an island that debuted in the RPG material, specifically the Roku era. So this is literally it's an island kind of halfway between the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom. So we're talking about the same general vicinity. It's fire islands in between, on the edge of the Fire Nation territory. This is where ships basically came to these places and picked up people who basically needed help, like basically help us out and we will give you money. And that's how they kind of signed up these kind of random volunteers effectively for Project Unanimity. From there, we get the explanation that they were, of course, separated based on if they were a bender, non-bender, and then what bending discipline they actually had. And because of the location we're talking about, it basically breaks down into firebender, earthbender, and non-bender. And they basically tell us like what happens with all of these groups. So the non-benders, of course, are trained in chi blocking. I suppose the like physically focused people were trained in herbalism, which in the context of kind of what's going on here kind of seems to be maybe towards like poison assassination, but that's just speculation. They mention the few earthbenders present had been marched deeper into the volcanic interior of the island for some unknown purpose. They never returned. That seems like a heavy implication of an attempt to turn earthbenders into lava bending, especially given one of the reveals they get to about the combustion bending and how they kind of draw it out. So we have to talk about this kind of paragraph here just kind of on its own. What are your thoughts on this? About like this is how they gathered up people. Okay, the chi blocking stuff kind of makes sense, but especially the earthbenders and the whole herbalism stuff. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the reveal of it is pretty cool. Even if, like you're saying before, like it would be cool to have a bit more sort of information on it. But the idea that they were collecting these benders and that they had, I guess Chai-Si, had the foresight that, there's some way that you can, I guess, sort of manipulate their elements to get, results that we, at least at this time, we didn't know were really sort of like available or had been studied or had really been a thing there. And it seems like the lava bending at least didn't really work the way that they sort of hoped it would be, or if we're assuming that's what they're actually going for. We don't, I guess, particularly know for sure. But in terms of just their, I guess, sort of idea to process them in this sort of way, I mean, it definitely does, feel very sort of, factory-like, which is what we, understood from the previous chapter, right? That was sort of the idea that we understand, or that our characters understand, of this sort of place and how they're actually working here. So chi blockers, earthbenders, and even herbalism, which, we're not fully sure what that is, but it definitely, to me, it sounded like, at least in this term of, I guess the world and its development, that was seen, at least if they're going towards the more nefarious ways, towards poisons or some other sort of, I guess, sort of ability that's sort of not as, I guess, more clandestine in terms of its actual use case here. I wonder, I don't know, it makes me wonder how, if we ever got more information on this sort of stuff, how this would play out in sort of the larger scheme of things, even though we know that, most of the people, at least that were left here from before, didn't really survive this, but, the information and knowledge, tends to spread in some way or factor.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, immediately after this, the Raite explains that the reason the place is basically empty is that several months ago, the camp runners basically left. No new recruits arrived and no supplies started to. And so they realized that this is the second Chai-Si lost control of Unanimity in the first book. She moved to basically cut ties to the island so that she wouldn't be like caught and there'd be no like connection back to her. Otherwise, they do sort of just explain it that basically all that's left of the entire project effectively is Thapa, these two kids here, and then the implication is that everyone else died. Like they seem to literally just like march the earthbenders into a volcano. The other combustion benders died in the process of trying to solve all of this, gain the powers. I guess the herbalism people poisoned each other is probably the implication of why they also never returned. And then, it leaves Raite and Sen as the only ones left here, because the few remaining other people, the adults, left on the one remaining ship, but there was a giant storm and there's a heavy assumption that that last remaining group died, meaning that the project is effectively gone, except for like literally a handful of people who we all know about, basically. So really interesting stuff. We obviously then turn our attention to Raite, like, what about you? And he's like, oh, I was in the firebending group. And immediately you connect the dots and like, okay, that means he is combustion bender candidate. And he says, as for our training, maybe it's better if I show you. So he brings them back to the kind of shore, kind of where they passed in a way before. And he kind of whispers in Yang Chen's ear the whole time as they make their way there. So when they arrive, Yang Chen knows immediately what to do. She goes into the avatar state and basically just clears out all of the water so they can actually see clearly what's going on here. And so there's chains all the way up the coast, kind of drilled into the kind of seafloor. And on the end is kind of like a cuff. And the idea, based on what Thoppa said in the first book, is that this is that first stage of the training. That you are held underwater by this chain. You have to kind of like hold your breath, and the only instruction that they were given was firebend underwater, not to produce a flame, but instead to fight against the surrounding pressure and exert as much force and will as you can in a single burst, an explosion. And so the idea is that the only way for someone to pass this first step is to basically blow up the chains underwater, and that's how you get out and survive, by literally proving yourself to be a combustion bender here. So this is why all these people died, drowned underwater. This is what all that talk was about. And it helps to explain to you, he says, the initial breakthrough only comes if you really truly believe you're going to die. And that seems to be the kind of core takeaway when it comes to this and the earthbending side of things, because especially on the lava bending side of things, we know that for Bolin, it took a life and death situation for him to unlock that ability. So there does seem to be an element with these really rare abilities of you needing to kind of have this traumatic need to unlock a higher level of power to make it happen, rather than maybe being born with the specific makeup to like just be born naturally with the ability. So it's an interesting reveal that like they're making it sort of like fully canon that that's a huge part of it as well, is unlocking an ability through means that most people would never go through. But what are your thoughts on the reveals that we get here about combustion bending and the training?
Yeah, that is, I don't know, it's really something to consider, and that's how they're sort of angling this sort of ability and skill and how it's sort of produced here, because a lot of what we've seen before, it's like what we said before, it's like hard work and bitter training and sort of perseverance and sort of pushing through sort of adversity, which you can consider this a form of adversity, but it's like the most extreme case of it, right? Like this is life or death in terms of your survival as a person here, and the ones who were able to survive are the ones who have, I guess, unlocked this ability here. And it makes me wonder, if other benders were put in this sort of situation, would this be a way with like the chains on the water, would that be metal bending if you put an earth bender there and they were able to sort of unlock the chains or something like that? Would have worked in that sort of case here? But it seems from what we've heard before in sort of like chorus time that it's easier to sort of unlock the ability of metal bending compared to say some of the other like sort of what we're now considering or learning are sort of like subclasses of the main primarily forms of bending here. So it definitely adds a lot to sort of think about and sort of how this functions in sort of the grander scheme of things. I wish we would eventually get even more sort of information on this sort of training and how it really sort of comes to full fruition, since this is really just sort of the first stage of things.
Yeah, like it helps us to classify things, definitely, because yeah, on the metal bending front, yeah, like Sue basically said that in her mind, anyone who tries hard enough and has the right training should be able to unlock metal bending, suggesting that you obviously need to train to become a skilled earthbender to have the skills necessary for metal bending, but that it's not out of the realm of possibility for nearly every earthbender to eventually get there with enough training. Whereas they're more leaning than the idea of like it takes a special kind of event to happen to change you in some way in this case, so that there's no training method like that's like say metal bending to just become a lava bender or a combustion bender, because you have to, either through some sort of a random traumatic incident or like vicious training like this, awaken it in some way. or at least these techniques haven't evolved enough to have proper training to really discover if there is a way to unlock it without kind of doing this sort of stuff. And it makes you wonder, like with the likes of, say, Pali and Combustion Man, how did they get their abilities, and was there some sort of an evolution in the technique that happened after this incident, or what? So it works really well, I think, with a lot of the other material that we have. Um, the problem that there ends up being is that I think the kind of unforgivable thing in terms of like what wasn't covered here was, how did anyone know to do this in the first place? Like, who came up with the idea, let's put a firebender underwater, and we know that if we tell them to do firebending in this way, 1 in 1,000 will develop this special ability? Like, who knew in the first place that this was a thing that was even possible? Like, you get the idea with with chi blocking, how you could like come across information about that, and like they say, they seem to sort of like forcibly invent that rather than having like an expert at chi blocking, which is why it doesn't seem as well developed here. You can understand how you can sort of come across the brainwashing kind of technique, because some of her book titles kind of related to subject matters that were similar, and they kind of forced out the investigation stuff there. But it's, especially because this is meant to be the origin of combustion bending, I really wish that there was a moment where we explained why Chai-Si knew this was a thing in the first place, because it's this interesting thing where we get like this interesting middle to the story, but we're never told the very, very start. And especially because we now find out that it is this whole like facility that was doing multiple different attempts to kind of create these special benders. Like, I just think there was a need to do a little bit more with the origin. And not necessarily with this chapter. I think it's more later on in the book, the fact that no one ever asks Chai-Si, like, hey, how did you even know to do this? Because I think all the pieces are there. Because like they reference some of the exact same stuff in this chapter, in the first chapter of the book. They just never properly connect the dots about when did she first find out about combustion bending. So what are your thoughts on that side of things? That like, that is effectively, they are the reveals in this book about combustion bending, but it isn't in any way the entire story. What are your thoughts on how far they did or didn't go?
Yeah, I get what you're saying there. I think, the history of, I guess, developing this technique isn't really, I mean, there's definitely not a one-to-one. It's like, oh, this person was in this sort of situation and they found that they had disability, and, this was, overheard and, was spread and et cetera, such and such. I mean, I think, I don't know. It feels like they're trying. I mean, the whole book, even from our last book, they're all about sort of the island that Chai-Si is from, how they're able to get sort of the night abalone, the sort of black pearls that are below, and how they're able to sort of push their bodies to these sort of depths, and they're able to sort of overcome things that they thought their body wouldn't have. So there's the whole idea that's been laid for them to be that okay, if you push your body, to certain lengths and you're willing to do this, that you'll be able to sort of do things that you've never even thought about. But it doesn't, as far as we know, firebenders, or I guess sort of benders in general, wasn't as much of a thing on her island, because these were, more, I guess you could say, non-benders that were able to pull off these feats of incredibleness that, you might not have thought they were able to do otherwise. So, the idea that this could be a thing in this world, it has precedence. So, like, that part doesn't seem, as weird, to me, in terms of, like, having the belief of this. Now, was there some sort of, I guess, maybe there was a crossover there somewhere where, the people who were, diving underwater were firebenders, and they were able to sort of figure this thing out in sort of a life or death situation. I mean, that could be totally plausible as well in this sort of case here, but we just don't really know it. I mean, I wonder if it would be worth more to know sort of the foundation, or more sort of the further steps in terms of developing this technique. I mean, I think some of the further, as far as like the pathways in the forehead and the insight chakras and all that sort of stuff, that could sort of be, I guess, sort of inferred from Chai-Si's sort of, interest in that sort of stuff and her being very well read and stuff like that, even on stuff that she shouldn't have access to, which is what we've noted from the previous chapter. So I think probably the future stuff you could probably not completely hand wave, but just sort of assume that there's a way to sort of figure it out. But it's harder to do that on sort of the history stuff unless you're sort of more taking more leaps and bounds on it, which is okay. I mean, you don't need to know everything per se, but it would be nice if even if we didn't find out the full sort of story of it, if there was like a point where Yang Chen made a note, just to herself that I'm gonna find this out from Chai Si because we know that basically you're the one that's protecting her right in the future, so like you could probably extract a lot of stuff from her, especially if she's willing to go through such lengths for certain things.
And I think the big problem that I have is that it feels like everything is there except what feels like a direct, like almost like cut chapter where it's like a secondary Chicey backstory where it's back on her island and you get the chapter where someone else on the island like blows up underwater, and at least then there's the sense of like, okay, like the end of this chapter makes the connection of the combustion bending training happens in the exact place where the diving for these kind of rare items happened. So it feels like this is the obvious explanation for how she would know about combustion bending in the first place, connecting the dots on, oh, someone must have been a firebender and they did something underwater, and depending on how that would have went, she goes on to look into this in terms of like research it and come across it that way. But the fact that there's nothing, it does make the very first chapter of the book stand out as being like very random in a way on its own, because the like we said when we started this, the only other Chicey focus chapter is chapter 14, which isn't really even about Chicey necessarily. It's just like the takeaway from that chapter is, oh, brainwashing and nothing else. So this feels like there's clearly some sort of a story here, but just that they decided not to tell it for some reason. Similarly, they do mention that Raite passed this first stage of training, but there is a multiple other stages of training when it comes to combustion bending that we don't hear about, and that the reason there's only 3 actual combustion benders is because the second stage onwards is where you really need the lung capacity, which is a bit weird that the first stage feels like you also need it, but I guess you need the size, you need like fully grown people to do whatever's up next, but they don't describe what the second phase of it actually is. Raite, as we see, doesn't really, I guess, know how to necessarily perform combustion bending correctly, other than the absolute basics. So I assume this is something about the like breath training, about charging up the attack. But again, it would have been nice to know some of that stuff. But the chapter here does end with everyone leaving the island, and they take the 2 kids with them, of course. And this brings us then into chapter 25, which is the price. So a short but hugely impactful chapter that I think is super, super well done in the few pages that it actually is. So basically, they think that the kids are asleep, and they have this discussion about basically, what are we going to do with them? Like, we don't know where their families are, if their families are still alive. And then even if we just like leave them with someone where they're safe and have a life, Raite, especially as a potential combustion bender, is one of the most valuable people in the world if anyone ever finds out about him. And we kind of then cut to basically later on, next day, they land outside Taku. They're about to kind of go in and sort everything out. And then Raite asks the question, hey, are you going to take down the people who ran the camp? Are you really going to bust Chai Si? And Yang Chen is like, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, I'll do exactly what you kind of say, effectively. She thinks he's asking the question because he wants effectively some revenge for what was done to him. And she's just like, oh, it's just a kid asking a question. But it's Kavik who realizes that actually he wanted the reverse answer. He wanted her to say, no, I'm not going to bust Chai Si, because he realizes, wait, the way these kids are going to view this, especially him, is that he's going to value his ability super highly above everything else, and he wants to make money from his ability, kind of like Thappa. And so last second he's trying to like call out to Yangchen to warn her. But what's happening here is that Raite is charging up a combustion bending attack, and no one is in a position to block this or dodge it or anything like that. So Kavik kind of like slams into Yangchen to get her out of the way, and it ends up being Nujian who steps in front of the blast and actually has to sort of like crush effectively Raite in the process. And so we get the sort of failed combustion bending kind of thing where multiple explosions happen. The specifics here seem to imply that it's a bunch of more like pressure explosions rather than actual full-on combustion bending blast, and it's that does the like internal damage here. But the idea is that like Nujian blocked about like 10-20 small combustion blasts, but the result of this is that Raite is dead, Nujian is also dead, and it's this huge turn of events of like, you did not expect this to happen. Nujian has saved everyone, but Nujian is gone, and Yangchen is in tears at the end, and everyone else is just like absolutely shocked by this. Like, we have the death of two characters in this like 3-page chapter. It's really crazy, but I like that it shows the kind of really dark side of like the kids being involved in the kind of training program, that it kind of has morphed them to view themselves in this way, like as assets, which is kind of the way the actual combustion benders are being viewed as well. So it's just tragic on all parts. I think everyone was like stunned by this chapter the first time they read it. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does have that sort of, shock stun factor to it. Because, I mean, characters have died and we've seen that happen, but it's always when you're least expecting it that it gets the most sort of out of you in terms of reaction here. And especially, the Avatar's companion, like that's as close of a character that you can get. That isn't, a full human character, and you do also lose a human character here as well, even if, we don't know Raite as well, of course. But, it's, any sort of character death, especially one that's sort of younger, will, gather some sort of response from people. So it definitely, it definitely does show the sort of darker side of things here. And, I guess you could sort of, maybe infer by his sort of a comment that he had on Toppa to begin with that, he wasn't sort of I don't know, maybe the hugest fan or had sort of the nicest sort of background, which, considering what, all of the kids or all of the people on this island had to go through, it's not a huge wonder to wonder why they might sort of think that sort of way. But yeah, it's definitely a shocking one, and definitely one that has, effects that are felt down the line for a while.
And I suppose with combustion bending, the way they describe effectively like part of why Raite was killed is that because he hadn't done all the training, his combustion bending blast, like they basically describe it that like it literally forced its way like through his forehead because he like didn't generate it like in front of his forehead, and instead like literally like he like forced like energy and power like through his head. So an even probably worse example of like combustion bending going wrong here without the training. So again, it speaks to like what is the rest of the training, but definitely ending on this moment of like kind of success for Yangchen, where like she knows some of this stuff from the island. It hasn't maybe given her the full solution and answer to everything, but things are going well, and now this is devastating because like Yangchen still isn't over the death of Jetson, and now here is the second companion, like referencing the Kyoshi book reference of Yangchen, that like two of her companions sacrificed themselves for her. This is the other one. This gets directly like referenced in that way of like, this is how to view Nujian. So it is Jetson and Nujian who are the two, and yeah, you kind of wonder, we're now heading into the kind of final third of the book. The big meetings are finally going to happen here in the build up to the world leaders arriving. Yangchen kind of needs to be at her best to go up against Chai Si, but how can she be after the loss of like her best friend? It's really brutal kind of chapter there. And then our final chapter for this podcast is chapter 26, Aftershocks. So we start with a Kavik report to the Order of the White Lotus, to Do, but also a Unarak is here as well. He hides certain information from his report, mostly about the existence of Xian. So we find out that she, of course, didn't die in the incident from the previous chapter. She doesn't have the same view of her skill set as Raite did. So she is just going to be sent to the Western Air Temple, where they will look after her, and that might be where she stays kind of full time. That is a little bit of an interesting one, because that suddenly means, chi blocking is somewhere present in the Western Air Temple. In the Roku era, Zaysan's love interest, Ryoshan, is a chi blocker, so this might be where chi blocking kind of finds a place in the Western Air Temple. It's a little bit of an interesting one to see if that's the intent there. But again, this is very much, Kavik / Yangchen's approach to doing things versus the Order of the White Lotus's approach. He doesn't like the way they are doing things. They only want access to the assets, they want control over unanimity, and they don't really care about kind of anything else in the process. They don't care if people die, and we get that with the idea of, them talking about Raite as an it on the basis of his abilities, and Kavik doesn't like that. Similarly, they don't really care too much about if the world leaders are killed. They're more like, that will give us an opportunity to claim the assets and stuff like that. So the result here is just that they view themselves as the ideal people to control unanimity because of the way the order is set up. And Do actually sort of notes that, it's a lot to put on one person. And what happens when that one person goes through something like a loss like this, they can't be in charge of all this stuff because they're so lost at that point. Whereas that can't happen to the Order of the White Lotus because it's such a scattered group all over the place and so on. So it is an interesting kind of view on the situation. And this is kind of roughly where kind of Kavik kind of realizes that, I guess they are kind of the only group trying to roughly help Yangchen out, even if they have a different opinion on things. So basically, we're just kind of left with the idea that the Order of the White Lotus is just going to let Kavik and Yangchen, make the next breakthrough and just kind of take advantage whenever that will happen. With a final note, of course, that even the Order of the White Lotus can't seem to locate Kalyan. He's noted as being too good, basically, even by a Unarak. And Kavik is further frustrated by that. So that's the first half of the chapter here, the Order of the White Lotus meet. So what are your thoughts on this scene?
I don't know. It really, I guess it's another one of those chapters, or at least the first half of this, that sort of drives home the sort of mentality and sort of the worldview that the White Lotus at this time in the Avatar worlds, how they view things, how they're willing to work from behind the shadows towards leading the world towards their version of, I guess, beauty and truth and tranquility and all of the other sort of buzzwords that they use to sort of, I guess, justify the way that they choose to do things, which it definitely does feel like it's at odds with, at least the idea of the Avatar at its core. But, I guess, the idea that it could help in the grander scheme of things, throughout the sort of generations, since they're not sort of so focused on just their sort of time period and their sort of doings, it could lead towards better things. But it definitely seems like they, like you've mentioned, they don't really care who they sort of trample in the meanwhile, just to sort of make sure that, over time that the world is at a better place. But I don't know, sometimes it feels like they're too sort of long-sighted, or they're being written in that sort of way, rather than sort of the short term of the world being in turmoil if, the world leaders were assassinated out of nowhere, which would, create, some sort of harm. I think maybe it would be cool if they thought, in a different way in terms of those terms. But yeah, it definitely feels like Kavik is just, he's just sort of at ends at this sort of situation in his report. It's just not really working well for him at all.
Yeah, and I think this scene especially with what like Oyunarak says is fascinating because of those like reveals from much earlier in the book about how the Order of the White Lotus is basically responsible for the Platinum Affair. They're responsible basically for the leaking of certain information about unanimity, which is causing this to be a sort of kind of the world is basically on a path to war, just with the relations between the nations at this point. That they're like, we are still the best to handle this, even though they have handled recent events really, really badly and actually don't have the most amazing success rate of coming up, that they don't have full control over all arms of the organization. While sure, that means they won't be broken by a single loss, they also can't fully trust everyone either. And then should this group, which caused the Platinum Affair, be the ones controlling the most important asset in the world? Probably not. It's a very interesting one, though. Like, the presentation of the Order of the White Lotus in the Yangchen novels, full stop, is just interesting, because they go from being the most like amazing group, like the White Lotus are incredible in Avatar, to this is a very flawed portrayal of them in this era, and it just speaks to the idea of like, yeah, some sort of a change is in order, and you hope they can do better. But I guess it seems like by the Kyoshi era, they are slightly better, that they're not as overly active, I suppose. But we get into the final section of this chapter, and that is Kavik heading back to the team's kind of safe house to kind of meet with Yangchen again. And there's a little bit of talk beforehand. He's just thinking to himself, like, he knows how much of a loss Nujian is to Yangchen, and because he, of everyone, has most heavily seen the idea of she is on the verge of making some kind of key choices about like what type of avatar she wants to be, he kind of almost wouldn't be surprised if he goes into her room and he finds effectively a different avatar in control, or a Yangchen who has made a decision to withdraw from the world and let someone else handle it. Could you blame her after everything that has happened? But instead, the whole team is invited in. She's in her bed, and she just basically gives the briefing from her bed. They get across the idea that it's clear she has been crying a lot, but she's been kind of keeping it private. And while she's not in a great position, she's not fully broken, I suppose is the idea. Keeping just enough kind of going here, which has kind of been the case for a while now. So all we get here, as we end the chapter here, is the idea that she's been thinking a lot about what Kalyan said to herself and Kavik. Let Chai-Si win. And she kind of wonders, is this basically what he told you and wanted you to do when he talked to you in Jandari? Is this effectively why you turned on me? And we're just left with this, like, Kavik's thought process about how he should answer this question. A simple, that's basically what happened, is the correct answer, but he can't bring himself to kind of almost give himself that get out of jail free card. He's kind of thinking about how everyone else in the group has given up something, they've put themselves on the line for the mission. He's the only one who hasn't really paid a super heavy price as part of the team. And he realizes that if they're going to make something happen here, that's going to have to change. He's going to have to kind of make a bit of a sacrifice play coming up here to really prove himself to the group once and for all. That it's finally like, okay, Kavik realizes he needs to make the grand gesture to get back in everyone's good books after all of this. And so really interesting, I think, way to end the chapter with just Yangchen thinking about, in a way, what if we did let Chai-Si win? If like, you had your moment of weakness over that. Is this my moment of weakness? And you don't really know why she's necessarily asking this question too much. And then what is Kavik's answer going to be? But what are your thoughts on where we end this kind of middle third of the book?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a low point for Yang Chen for sure here, and this, all of Kavit's sort of reasoning about, sort of what he's done up until this point, how he can be sort of blamed for, every sort of situation that's sort of come in some form or fashion. It really starts to weigh down on him, and we can already see the weight that has been putting on Yang Chen. Like you said, she's just been running on basically like sort of like fumes at this point and enhanced tea. So it definitely, you really don't know, how much she's willing to go. And even when they were talking with the White Lotus, how it's a lot to put on one person. Even your faith on that person is a lot for them to sort of have, and they can only go sort of so far. But it seems like Yan Chen isn't quite so broken at this point, but she is, at least it feels like at this point at the end of the chapter that she's willing to go towards, some lengths that maybe she wasn't quite ready to go for before, or to use, her assets in ways that she, didn't necessarily think she would have to before. But now after this sort of loss here, she's at that point where she's considering other things, but it doesn't seem like she's given up her full sort of, I guess you could say, humanity or hope in sort of the human condition quite
Hmm.
yet.
And yeah, the other angle on this is definitely that, yeah, the core of what, like, as well, Kalyan said to her was basically, you should think about the way you've kind of treated Kavik in all of this, and you can tell that that's part of this as well, so that she, in a way, is kind of willing to give him kind of the out here of just like, if he did say like this is what happened, she'd maybe be okay with it. Is that, yeah, like we need to really see how kind of she thinks about this, and if I remember correctly, we will get kind of more of that as we go forward. But yeah, we're going into the final third of the book here, where of course the plan coming up. We're going to get the big moments of like kind of Chaise's kind of actual plan as the villain. We have to see like what's going on with Thappa, where is he, and there's still quite a bit to deal with here. And the final third is very very interesting, but we will get to that next time out. So yeah, just one more podcast on Legacy of Yangchen to go. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to that in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, other than that, that has been episode 263 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.